So glad you're here. Whatever brought you here today, I'm just glad you're here. Even if you didn't want to be here today, I'm still just glad you're here. I know what that's like. I can remember crying my way through church when I was a little kid, and in fact, I pitched such a fit, my dad didn't go back. I'm sad to say that, but I understand. Whatever brought you here, I'm just glad you're here today. Wherever you are on your faith journey, even if you don't think you're on a faith journey, I'm still just really glad you're here today. So I recently received an email from a realtor. At least it was purporting to be from a realtor, and I'm kind of suspicious of things. So I took a screenshot, and I know the realtor. I took a screenshot of that and looked up the person's internet email address just to make sure I'm sending it to the real guy, and I sent it to him, and I said, "Is this you?" And it came back and said, "Yes, it's me." And I thought, a scammer would say the same thing. So I emailed back and I said, "Tell me something about me that you would, not only you, but you would know about me that a scammer wouldn't." And he came back with an appropriate answer, and I thought, that's good. I know you're the real. That was your son, John. Anyway, your brother Caleb, or wherever Caleb went. Anyway, so I knew it was not a scam. So I got to admit, I'm a little bit suspicious about most things in life. Like you just don't earn trust, at least for me, very easily. And I think that's a wise position to take in life. Because scammers, and there's all kinds of scammers, not only the internet and email, all that kind of stuff. Their businesses, whatever. There's people that just purport themselves to be one thing and they're not, and people can be that way. You got to watch out, I guess, for all this internet dating. People can say anything they want about themselves and it not be true. So you got to be a little bit careful. Last week we took a deep dive into the subject of forgiving those who have hurt us. And if you weren't here for that message, I'd encourage you to listen to that. It's on our webpage. It's on Faith Outpost Sermons on YouTube. It's a very eye-opening and enlightening message about the importance of forgiving. And I said at the beginning, it's my goal to help everybody in the room to forgive anyone and everyone who's ever hurt them. And the reason is holding on to that hurt hurts you. Holding on to that hurt hurts you in way more ways than you may be aware of. And I understand there are deep, deep, deep hurts that people go through in life. And so I'd encourage you to listen to that message. I'm not going to go back over it. But today, the message, and this is what I promised from last week, is I called it, this is the title of it, "I forgive you, but I don't trust you." I forgive you, but I don't trust you. And we're going to look at a life, 3 chapters today. Anyway, we're going to look at a guy from the Old Testament. His name is Joseph. And in just in case you know, you might have heard of a guy by the name of Joseph, and you think, well, isn't he married to Mary? Wasn't he married to Mary? Well, yeah, that is a Joseph, and that's in the New Testament. But this is a Joseph from the Old Testament, the time period before Christ, BC. Anyway, and his story is found in Genesis. Genesis is the very first book in the Bible. So if you opened it up, it's easy to find because it's right at the beginning. In fact, that's what Genesis means. Genesis means beginnings or origins. And so his story is found in Genesis, and it starts in Genesis chapter 37. So he forgave his brothers, and I went through that. I'm not going to go through that again. And I believe that he forgave his brothers long before they ever asked for forgiveness. Because some people think, well, if they ever come to me and if they ever say, "I'm sorry, and would you forgive me?" then I might forgive them. No, it's to our benefit to forgive, even if the person never asks for it, never admits that they did wrong. It's to our benefit to forgive, and just don't hold on to any reasons. Because to go through life in an unforgiving spirit is like walking through life with a ball and chain around your ankle. It is hindering you in more ways than you know. Physically, mentally, spiritually, relationally. It's just, so that's why I'm passionate about that. So this is about trust. This is about trust. So I can't go through the whole story about Joseph because it goes from 37 of Genesis to 50. That's a lot of narrative material to try to cover, and we're not going to try to go back and rehash all of that. Let me just review some things. So what we've got today, what we're going to see, is one elderly man by the name of Jacob, also known as Israel, and one younger sibling known as Benjamin. 2 trips to Egypt, because what was happening was there was a period of 7 years where there was an abundance of grain being produced. And so they started an emergency savings plan in Egypt, and they stored up just tons and tons and tons of grain, and because there was 7 years of famine that was coming. And so there's 2 trips to Egypt. The 2 trips are from Joseph's. Joseph has been sold as a slave, and now he's this prime minister in Egypt. And his family doesn't know that. They think he's dead, long gone, or whatever. And so his brothers are going to go down to Egypt and buy some grain. Guess who they have to buy it from? So there's 2 trips to Egypt. This is going to cover 3 chapters in the Bible. There's 10 older brothers. Joseph had 11 brothers and 1 sister. But the 11 brothers, 10 of them were older, 1 of them was younger. And that all comes into play in all this. We're going to do this in about 35 to 40 minutes. You might chuckle by me saying that. And there's going to be a few tense moments in the narrative. So we're going to try to cover all this. So, and I did it like this. So trip number one. Again, famine in the land. It's been going on for at least a year, maybe into 2 years. And there's the ground isn't producing anything. And so all the supplies get used up. This is the day before, warehouses and refrigerators, and so you just start running out of food. You probably got to start killing the camels and the donkeys or whatever, just to survive. And so trip number 1. So Joseph's father, Israel, also known as Jacob. Okay, so he's back in Canaan, Israel, and I love the way chapter 42 starts off with. He basically says, this is what he says, why are you just standing around looking at each other? There's grain down in Egypt. Or, what today we might say, why are you just standing there twiddling your thumbs? Which means, why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you taking the initiative and doing something about this? He says, I've heard there's grain down in Egypt. I can tell you why they were twiddling their thumbs. Egypt was a sore spot in their hearts because they had sold their younger brother Joseph as a slave to a band of traders that were going, guess where? Down to Egypt. And so the mention of the name Egypt, you know what that's like? You got a guilty conscience about something, and the subject comes up. It's kind of like this. Don't want to go there. They didn't want to go there. That's why I'm convinced. Anyway, so he says, you need to go down to Egypt and buy some grain. And he says to them, but I don't want you to take Benjamin. Now, Benjamin was Joseph's younger brother. So he's number 12 out of 12 brothers. Joseph would have been 11, but Benjamin was number 12. And he says, I don't want you to take Benjamin because I don't want anything to happen to him. And so when you read that, you think, Benjamin must have been a little boy. And I don't want him going across the desert. You got to get this. Genesis 46, fast forwarding a little bit. When the whole family ends up moving down to Egypt, Benjamin goes with them. Benjamin, now get this, had 10 sons that he took with him. Benjamin was not a little kid. He was a grown man with hair on his chest, a beard on his chin. He was a grown man. And now listen, Dad is saying, you guys can go. I care, but if anything happened to you guys, that wouldn't be as bad as if something happened to Benjamin. Like, wow. And what would they be thinking? They'd be thinking, that's exactly what he felt. That's the way he related to Joseph. And that's why we hated Joseph. That's why we sold Joseph as a slave, because Dad played favorites, and now he's doing the same thing with Benjamin. And it tells us in Genesis 44 that Jacob had an unhealthy soul tie. That's what I call a soul tie to Benjamin. And it says his life was bound up with Benjamin. His life was bound up. If you think of them as two circles, instead of being two separate circles, they were intertwined. Jacob's happiness was tied to Benjamin's happiness, and vice versa. And that's what some people call a soul tie. What we call it today is codependency. And Jacob was tied to his son, and he just, I'm not going to let anything happen to him. So that's kind of interesting. So the 10 go down to Egypt to purchase grain, and unbeknownst to them, who do they encounter in order to purchase the grain? So if you're not familiar with the story, what happened, Joseph went down to Egypt as a slave. He ended up in prison because he was falsely accused. And then he ended up interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh that said there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said, you're a smart dude. We're putting you in charge of all of the land. Nobody is greater in the land other than me as Pharaoh. And you're in charge of collecting a certain amount, a percentage of all the grain so that we have it for those 7 years that will be coming off in the future. So Joseph is in charge of the whole granary, right? And so when his brothers come down from a foreign country, and Hebrews would have looked like Moses, when he came out of not when he was in Egypt, but when he came back. Have you ever seen the movie? The Ten Commandments? Anyway, he would have looked rough and long beards and that kind of a look. Egyptians were more clean cut and different kind of. So they were coming down into this foreign country. Didn't have to have a passport, but they came through and they had to buy the grain from guess who? Joseph. Now, they don't recognize him because he looks very Egypt. Like I said last week, he walked and talked like an Egyptian, So he's there, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. So on this first trip, number one, there's a couple of tests. And this is where we get into the I forgive you, but I don't trust you. Okay, so he starts testing his brothers. Some people interpret this to say he's messing with them. Now, he's not messing with them, he's testing them. This is not revenge because he'd already forgiven them. This is testing them, wanting to know, can I trust you? Will you do the same thing? Again, the position of power has shifted. He's the one that's now in the position of power, and they're not. But, even people that are abused when they're children and they grow up and to be an adult, and even though they have the strength of being an adult, they can still be scared to death of the person that abused them when they were little. And so there's things that there's reasons for that, which we won't go into. But anyway, he says to them, here's your spies. You've come to spy out the land to see where our weakness is. And they say, no, we're not spies. He said, yes, you are. No, we're not. Yes, you are. No. So they go back and forth, ping-ponging that back and forth for a while. And Joseph said, you're spies. You're going to jail. So he puts them in prison. He puts them in jail for 3 days. And I think during that 3 days, it doesn't tell us what was going on in his heart, but I think he's praying. I think he's in a dilemma. I think he's wondering, what do I do with my brothers? Should I make myself known to them? Should I say, hey, guys, I'm Joseph? What's going on here? And he's still wondering, have you changed? Are you still the same? Are you going to treat me the same way, emotionally, whatever? Is it going to be the same kind of relationship that we had? It says at the beginning that he and his brothers, they could not speak a kind word to him. Is it going to go back to that same kind of relationship? Can I trust you? So he throws them in jail. And then he comes back to them in after 3 days, and he says, I'm a God-fearing man. And he said, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to keep one of you here in prison, and the rest of you can go home, take grain back to your family, and then you cannot come back and buy grain, because they had told him they had, and I love this, they said, we are 12 brothers. One of them is still back with our father. The other one is no more. And you catch the irony of that? They're speaking to the one who they say is no more. I don't know how you would have handled that. I don't know how I would have handled it. I would have been going. at least in my heart, right? This is the irony of this story. It is so. This is better than All My Children. This is better than soap operas. But you ought to read it sometime. You ought to pick up the Bible and read it. There are fascinating narratives that are so vital for things that we can learn from them. And so he takes one of them, and I don't know if he did it, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but he picked one by the name of Simeon. Maybe Simeon was his least favorite. I don't know why. It doesn't tell us why. But he picked one of the 10 and said, I'm going to keep him in jail. And you can go back with grain. Take the grain back to your families. But don't come back unless you bring your younger brother. So test number 2. The first one is, are you... You're spies? No, we're not. That's going on. And the test number 2 is, I'm going to keep Simeon. You can't come back unless you bring your younger brother. So, you think of it, they don't know who he is. I know how I would have thought before I became a Christian. But Dad's not going to let us bring Benjamin. Let's just take one of the servants and let's pass him off as Benjamin. How would this Egyptian dude know? There's no way he could know that he's not Benjamin. So anyway, they go back. And after a while, doesn't tell us how long, they ran out of grain again. And the dad says, you need to go back and buy some more grain. And they had told him the story of what had happened. And he says, they say, we can't go back unless Benjamin is with it. And then Jacob is going, well, why did you tell him that you had a younger brother? Well, he asked, about our lives. He asked about our aged father. He asked about our family. I don't know why he was asking all these personal questions, but he was asking all these questions. Of course, we know why he was asking the questions, but because, we've read the story. But anyway, so he says, okay. So anyway, I love this. Judah, one of the 10. In fact, he's number 4 age-wise. He's the 4th oldest. He goes to his father, and this is in Genesis 43, 8 and 9, and he says this. Now, we're going to come back to this in a little bit later. Then Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. In other words, Dad, this is serious stuff. We're going to die if we don't get more grain. It says, I myself will guarantee Benjamin's safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. I will bear the blame. You can hold me accountable for if we do not bring him back. So Jacob relents and says, okay, go. If that's the way it has to be, go. So they go back to Egypt. So they pass tests 1 and 2. They don't abandon Simeon because they're coming back. They don't take somebody in Benjamin's place instead of him, a servant or somebody. So they bring Benjamin. So in in Joseph's mind, he's going, check. But they could have lied, and they could have just tried to deceive him. So they passed tests 1 and 2. So test number 3. So while they're there the second time, Joseph tells his steward, his servant. Now Joseph is speaking Egyptian. He's speaking through an interpreter. But he tells his steward, tell them to come to my house for lunch. Come to my house for lunch. And so they go to his house. They're kind of like, what's going on here? It'd be like going into a palace. And what's going on here? And Joseph had them all arranged. It must have had name tags at it, but he had them arranged from oldest to youngest. And they're probably thinking, how does he know? What's going on here? And at Benjamin's seat, there was 5 times as much. So if it was hamburgers or cheeseburgers, they each had one big juicy, did I say that? I keep saying you guys ought to try the juicy, cheesy cheeseburger, and Benjamin had 5. And his pile of fries was huge. And they just had theirs. It was enough. It was plenty for them. And they're thinking, so why did Joseph do that? Because he had been treated favorably by their dad. and they were jealous, and they were unkind to him, do they still hold that kind of thing in their heart towards Benjamin? Now, Jacob, we didn't go into this, Jacob had 4 wives. One of his favorite wife was Rachel, and it happened to be that Benjamin and Joseph were brothers of the same mother. All the other brothers were brothers from other mothers, literally. But Joseph and Benjamin had the same mother, Rachel, who was Jacob's favorite wife. You think this guy would learn from Abraham's mistakes when he did that kind of thing? Anyway, which is their grandfather down the road, earlier. Anyway, so he's treating Benjamin favorably on purpose to see the reaction of the brothers. And they're not muttering, they're not like thinking. Now remember, he acts like he doesn't understand their language, and they could have been saying, why does Benjamin get so much? Why is he treating him so favorably and treating us less favorably? They could be muttering and complaining. And so check for test number 3. No word about the favorable treatment that Benjamin received. Okay, so the final test is coming up. So Joseph says, okay, good. He sends them on their way. But before he sends them on their way, he does test number 4. Now this is ingenious. He takes a silver cup, actually has his steward, his servant to do it, takes his silver cup from his house, and he hides it in Benjamin's supplies. So then they're on their way out of town, and before they could leave the country, probably before they left the city, Joseph sends his little army after them and says, somebody stole my silver cup. Got to come back. And whoever stole the silver cup is going to go to prison, going to go to jail for that. And they all say, oh no, we're honest men, nobody would do that. And so they start checking all of their supplies, and guess what? They find the silver cup in Benjamin's supplies. And they all go, oh my gosh, I don't know. Their hearts sink. And they realize, and so they start pleading with Joseph. We're your servants. Let's put us all in prison. Because they couldn't stand to go back and see their dad. Right? It's like, just put us all in prison. There's no sense in even going home. Just put us. And Joseph says, nope, only the one who stole my silver cup will go to prison. So that's test number 4. So then Judah begins to intercede with Joseph. Now we have a word. You ever pray for somebody? I'm sure you have, right? Maybe, most of you. When you pray for somebody, you're interceding for them. You're asking God to do something on their behalf. And so Judah begins to intercede with Joseph on behalf of Benjamin. And this is what he says. He basically pleads with him. He offers himself as a substitute. And these verses, this is Genesis 44, verses 30 to 34. It says, so now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant, talking about him, Judah, guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, speaking to Joseph, please let your servant, him, Judah, remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. But he's probably thinking back to the misery that came on their father when Joseph didn't return back all those years ago. And they had this Joseph's coat and dipped it in, blood. And that's back before the days of DNA testing. And it just looked like this is Joseph's blood, and that he didn't really They just said, is this Joseph's coat? They really didn't lie, but they deceived, right? And Joseph, their dad looks at it and says, oh, Joseph is dead. Some animal has torn him to pieces and gobbled him up. And so, as far as Jacob's concerned, Joseph is no more. And so here's Judah. And he's saying, how can I bear to see the misery of my father? I guaranteed his safety. I will bear the blame. I said that to my father. I will bear the blame. And he offers to substitute himself in place of Benjamin. Put me in prison. I will suffer in Benjamin's place. I will suffer in Benjamin's place. He's willing to suffer for the sin of somebody else. Now keep in mind, as far as they're concerned, Benjamin really stole it. How else did it get there? He's willing to so he's interceding and he's putting himself in the place of the guilty in order for the guilty to go free. Isn't that amazing? Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. From those 12 brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel came into existence. And Judah is the lineage that's traced throughout the rest of the Old Testament in great detail. In fact, you could read in Luke and in Matthew that goes back to those genealogies that traces that in both Matthew and Luke at the beginning of those two Gospels in the New Testament. And it clearly proves that Jesus was a descendant of Judah. The Lion of the tribe of Judah. It's important. And Jesus substituted himself in our place. He was willing and did take the punishment that was meant for me. It was meant that we deserved so that we could go free. Jesus is our substitute. The substitutionary sacrifice of Christ on the cross. That's what was happening there. So I want to get some good juicy tidbits out of here. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. A lot of people confuse if I forgive somebody, then I have to trust them. No. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness is an undeserved gift. Nobody deserves to be forgiven. I don't deserve to be forgiven by God. If I offend somebody, I don't deserve to be forgiven. If that person forgives me, it is a free gift. That's the way forgiveness works. It is never deserved by anybody. You can't earn forgiveness. You can't earn God's forgiveness by serving him with your life. Because there is no way that your 70, 80, 90, if you live to be 100 years, can pay God back for the price that he paid on the cross when Jesus substituted himself in your place. It's not an equivalent. Never could be, never will be. Even if you lived as long as Methuselah lived, you could not pay God back. You could not earn. None of us can earn God's forgiveness. It is a total free gift. And that's the way it is when we forgive one another. But on the other hand, trust is always earned. Trust is always earned. We're foolish if we foolishly trust. Right? If we just foolishly trust without some evidence, and we look for evidence. That's why we have Angie's list. That's why somebody might put on Facebook, anybody know a good mechanic? They're looking for a recommendation. If you trust them, maybe then I can trust them. That's not always, doesn't always come through. But, we're looking for evidence that we can trust. Looking for reliability in a company, in a provider. We're looking for that. We should look for it also in relationships. I can remember times disciplining my kids when they were at home. They lied or they cheated, whatever they did, and one of them would say, "You don't trust me." And I said, "You're darn right I don't trust you. I forgive you, but I'd be stupid to trust you right now because you haven't earned it." And I would follow it up and say, "But you can earn it back. You can earn it back." And how do we earn? See, trust is always earned. Forgiveness is always free. Trust is always earned. Forgiveness is always free. And we need to keep those two things clear in our mind. If you're the one who has broken trust, don't expect the person whose trust you violated just to start trusting you because you're making promises to them. Promises, those kinds of promises are often broken. And so what my advice to people who would come to me as a therapist, as a counselor, would say, don't trust the words. Trust the action. Trust what you see, not what they say. Look for proof. Test the waters before you jump in, because that's what Joseph was doing. He was testing the waters before he jumped in. Believe performance, not mere promises. You need to underscore this in your mind. You will never trust until you genuinely forgive, even if they've proven to be trustworthy. If you don't forgive them, if you don't forgive somebody, you're holding suspicion and something against them, and even if for the rest of their life they prove to be absolutely trustworthy, you still won't trust them. So it's important. It's important to forgive. It's important to test the waters. So what we see, just kind of, we begin to land this plane, we see the gospel portrayed. Joseph suffered for the sins of others and became their deliverer. He suffered for their sins because of their sins. They sold him as a slave. He was enslaved or imprisoned for 13 to 14 years of his life, from 17 to 30, because his brothers sold him as a slave, because they hated him. And it's like he suffered because of their sins. Jesus suffered because of our sins. And Joseph became their deliverer. He provided for them. He said, bring your families down. There's going to be 5 more years of famine. Bring the family down and live here, and I will take care of you, and I will provide for you. See, when we forgive somebody, we're willing to do that. We're willing to put ourselves in a position, as long as it's safe. Now, I know if an abuser, whatever, it may not be safe to go back into a relationship with them, personal kind of relationship. I get that. It may not be wise and it may not be safe, but you can still desire them to be blessed. So instead of praying for those fleas of 1,000 camels to infest their armpits, you're praying that God would genuinely bless them. You're praying for God to forgive them. Like Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. Even the people that were nailing him, the people that were physically responsible, he's praying for their forgiveness. And so we may not be in a position to bless them, but aren't you glad that when God forgives us, he still wants to provide for us? He still wants to care about us? He still wants to have a close personal relationship with us? It's not like, I'll forgive you, but I don't want anything to do with you. That's not forgiveness. I'll forgive you, but I won't forget. That's not forgiveness. It's important. So we see the gospel being portrayed. 1 Peter 3:18 says, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. So we also see Judah portraying the gospel. Judah was willing to bear the blame and substitute himself so Benjamin could go free. I love this in Isaiah, about 600 years before Jesus was born on planet Earth. It says, therefore, in Isaiah 53:12, therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, the thieves on the cross, on the one on the right and the one on the left. I love that song. We sang there. He was numbered with the transgressors, for he bore the sin of many. He bore our sin, it was placed onto him, and made intercession for the transgressors. That same chapter in Isaiah says, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity, the sin of us all. Jesus bore that in his body. Now, if you're a Christ follower, if you've genuinely given your life to Christ, you are forgiven, whether you know it or not, whether you feel it or not. You are forgiven. Everything. Everything. Freely. Because Jesus bore it all on the cross. See, that's the basis of our forgiveness. It's not our performance, it's his. He gives us his record of righteousness. We give him, he takes our record of unrighteousness. And so that's the forgiveness. He has forgiven us. Now, I want to kind of wrap up. Terry thought, I shared this with her yesterday. She goes, oh, that's cool. Here's a summary of last week and this week in 2 sentences. I could have just started with this and said, time to go home. And you probably would have said, thank you. So anyway, when seeking to forgive, grace you must freely give. When seeking to forgive, grace you must freely give. When looking to trust, reliability is a must. Isn't that cool? I hope you remember that. I hope it sticks. Hope it sticks. If you don't remember this whole back and forth, the 2 trips and the 4 tests and the 10 brothers and the younger sibling and the older dad, if you don't remember the whole story, I hope you remember that. When seeking to forgive, grace you must freely give. When looking to trust, reliability is a must. Let me wrap up. We're going back to a verse that we looked at last week in Ephesians 4:32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Do you see the connection between kindness and compassion and forgiveness? We're not being kind and compassionate to somebody we haven't forgiven. In fact, there's a parallel, not 100%, but there's a parallel between unforgiveness in our hearts towards person A and being less kind and less compassionate to persons B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. Don't you wish we lived in a world that was a little bit more kind and compassionate? Don't you wish Republicans and Democrats would be kind and compassionate to each other? Don't you wish husbands and wives would be kind and compassionate to each other? Don't you wish parents and children would be kind and compassionate to one another? What would the world be like if we followed that one verse? That's the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me ask you, whose sins today are you suffering because of? That may be the person or the people you need to forgive. Who sins today? Who has wronged you, hurt you, divorced you, abandoned you, rejected you, lied about you, fired you, X, Y? Who do you need to forgive? Second question. Is there someone that you're wondering, should I trust them or not? I hope you got some wisdom out of this for both of those 2 very important